because I think this is, to my mind, this is actually one of the more interesting things that's been going on. There's two parallel paths, as I kind of hinted on when we were talking here, and this is not a exposition. This is in a general. Yes, Rocket Chat needed to do Mongo. There are a number of things that this illustrates, and I think it's worth a conversation. So if you guys want to raise your hands, you want to say something, let's kind of discuss this out. This isn't meant to be a one-sided kind of discussion. So MongoDB, we'll start off with some real grounding on what's going on. And it's not nearly as serious. I mean, this is kind of a niche thing in a niche field, so maybe it's not as serious as the open source people take it. But there's been two parallel things going on. Patrick came in and talked to us about open washing, and the concept there was people claiming things are open source when they're not. And what that comes down to is, who has the right to define words? So open source was coined as software that meets, a certain set of rules as the open source definition, and it's commonly understood, to mean exactly that. So one of the pushes has been they've been very protective of that term. They don't have a trademark on open source. It was decided that open source is not trademarkable because it is too generic in usage. But they have the right, so they have these set of standards, and open source certified or open source approved is actually a trademark term. So the question is, what does open source mean? And do companies have the right to come in and change the definition of words to meet what they want the definition of the words to mean? Which is kind of an interesting thing. So one of the things that came out of this was open source OSI tries to protect the open source approved or the open source licenses, portion of the infrastructure. They're very, like I said, they're very protective of that term. And there was a big thing out saying, why do they get to decide what's open source and what's not? And, well, the big why is because, people have generally understood open source to be something that meets the 10 definitions because they coined the phrase and have been using it. And can somebody else come in and just arbitrarily call their stuff open source without meeting any of the same standards? And this is the same debate that you'll hear in all natural or organic terms they're not copyrightable, they're not trademarkable, because they're in common usage, but they have specific meanings when applied to, for example, food or vitamins or things like that. And, are you false advertising? So that's part of this discussion. The other part of this discussion is MongoDB was very supportive of the open source community back when, the open source community was a way that they were growing their company and making money. And then they ran into a snag where the open source stuff didn't quite suit them. And part of this is probably related to the fact that they got venture capital funding, and the venture capitalists are not as patient as the original founders. So there was a push for a revenue stream earlier. So the attempt was made in two different ways. One was to get the OSI to approve a license that would require Amazon, by distributing MongoDB as part of their, or by allowing people to use MongoDB, standing it up as part of the standard installation on their AWS servers, would require them to open source their entire ecosystem, right? Which seems a little excessive, right? If this is like one component in 30, and now you have to open source everything that you put on that system that you have control over. It also seems impractical. What if you're running on Windows, and Windows is part of your delivery platform, and Windows at the time was licensable? They certainly didn't have the ability to even open source the Windows system. So there's some thoughts about how practical this was from a legal standpoint, and other thoughts about where the violations actually lie, and the violations actually lie in the encumbrance of other software, and possibly in discrimination against fields of endeavor. But it's not. I have to take a look at that again. That might be a good thing to take a look at before Friday. So MongoDB was working in an open source community. They took in contributions from other members of the community. They retained the copyright to their contributions and any other contributions that were made to the software. So under those circumstances, they absolutely had the legal right to change the licensing, right? And they felt that by going forward with this, that they would allow themselves, that it would be a public good, right? They would allow themselves to make money, which would allow them to continue, offering what was largely an open source product to a lot of different individuals, while taxing another subset of companies that were making wide-scale use of their server product. So the first thing that's not in dispute is that MongoDB absolutely has the right, because they retained copyright, to change the license, right? You can change the license. The other thing that's not in dispute is that anybody who had a previous version of MongoDB, or who downloaded MongoDB tagged, without any of their patches, who used the code that was originally licensed under the original AGPL license, had a right to retain that, right? They cannot retroactively remove rights from you. So those two things are not in dispute. Anybody who had a previous version of MongoDB before the change could continue to use that under the terms of the AGPL, and by the way, could fork it, could stand up their own repository, and could continue to develop it, which is kind of interesting. And that's one of the things we want to talk about is when you're in a community organization, right? You have this the ultimate revolution is forking. And by any of the open source licenses, you are allowed to do that. And you can take it under the terms of the license when you actually made the pull. Right. So those two terms are absolutely not in dispute. Anybody who had a version before October 10th, you see that even in their README, they state that before October 16th, 2018, that is licensed under AGPL. Those versions are licensed under AGPL. And anything after that is licensed under the server-side public license. So those two terms really aren't in dispute. License was changed. They had a right to change it. People had a right to keep the old one and build on it. So now you want to look at how this affects 4 different communities. The first community is MongoDB, right? So they were not making the profit they thought they deserved based on the installations of their software, which is, a business decision. By abandoning, essentially an open source license, and actually in some ways starting a war against the open source community as a whole, they actually had an impact on their company. The second is to those employees and outside contributors who contributed code to an open source project only to see the open source nature kind of stripped away. Right now, this was not as egregious as taking it private, taking it proprietary, but it was abandoning. If you were an acolyte of the philosophy of open source, right, your contribution that you made to an open source business, because you didn't hold copyright to your own contributions, was now essentially removed from your, let's say you wanted to stand up an AWS, and your business plan was to take MongoDB that you had contributed to and build it into the biggest cloud server in the country. Well, you no longer have that opportunity, right? So you contributed code that a subsequent change of license actually removed from your is now limiting your ability to use it as you see fit. It's no longer open source. So we have the company, MongoDB. We have the employees and contributors. And then we have the users of the software in terms of, Amazon and, and other cloud providers who were supplying images, machines that had MongoDB installed, who are now faced with the choice of either open sourcing the entirety of the software on their node, or the entirety of the software that supported their ability to do billing, etc. on the node, or paying Mongo for a license, or not using it. And I think, in general, I have to confirm this, but I believe that most of them no longer provide Mongo as part of the standard image. You have to install it yourself, which is a really cheap way for them to get around it. But it doesn't. It does impact their ability to offer you, rollout solutions. All they had to do though was replace MongoDB with something else. And people who had never used their service before would probably not notice the difference. And the people who had been using MongoDB, well, they would just have to go out and reprovision themselves. So that's 3 communities. The 4th community is users who of the AWS services who aren't really part of this battle, but lost the convenience of being able to do this on their own and having to lost the convenience of having AWS handle all of this for them, and who now have to roll up MongoDB on their own if they want to use it. There's a lot of complications here, and this affected a lot of different groups, differently. I don't think it was nearly as successful as MongoDB had hoped. Again, I haven't seen marketing information, but that's kind of the framework that I would like to kind of start a discussion on, if you guys have anything to say about it, pertaining to any of those groups. Any thoughts? I think I'm going to add a paragraph to our lab to pick one of those groups and say something on it. So just be thinking about it. With that in mind, unless you have more questions, I think at this point we're about 16 minutes from the end of class. I've been letting you guys get out way too early. Not. I think we'll just, I think this will be the end of the class. Questions, comments, thoughts? All right. We will see you guys later. We'll see you on Friday for our lab. Yeah, there are so many open source current events going on. That one's, I'm still trying to figure that one out. Google versus Oracle, that was decided one way and then reversed, and now it looks like it's back to decided the original way again. You know what? We will discuss these. If you remind me, we will discuss these next week. Yeah, so I'm still trying to figure out exactly what happened with the Stallman thing. I'm not hearing allegations. I'm hearing allegations of sexism and nastiness. I'm not sure. I would like to have more details about why he stepped on originally and why he was allowed to come back. So if you guys want to do some research, I would love to see some postings on exactly the situation, because it's been very kind of, what I saw was Richard Stallman's a bad guy and he's mean, and and so we forced him to step down, and then he decided he wanted to come back, and so we let him, and it's like none of it makes any sense to me. I can tell you that he's a strange man. But yeah, that would be a good topic for discussion. We can talk about that. That one and the Google versus Oracle. My understanding of the Google versus Oracle. That was, like I said, that was originally litigated a few years, about a decade or so ago, and then it came back recently and was litigated the other way, and so we'll see what happens there. That is a very interesting picture, or a series of pictures, Hunter.